Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all enjoyed your lunch. We're now back for the third, really, of this kind of trilogy of papers that we're starting the day with. And I sincerely hope that the discussions of fascism and technology this morning have not irked any technological gremlins, because we're going to be doing the next one via Skype. So, if I cue Hida, hopefully Morgan should appear on screen. Hello, Morgan. Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, we've passed the first test. I'm not going to say any more. Obviously, we have the discussion session after this, so please continue to kind of think through contributions and questions to that for Morgan as well as for Anna and Giovanna from earlier on. But without further ado, I'd like to welcome Morgan Quaintance.
Okay, this is weird. Like, please forgive me because this is like I've never done this talk via Skype before, so the weird disconnect I'm feeling, sort of strange telepresent alienation that I'm feeling, may come through in a kind of stilted delivery. What I'm going to probably do is, I'm increasingly finding it a bit difficult to talk from prepared bits of text. I find it a bit false and a bit strained. So I tried to do that for you because I thought if I just ramble and I'm on Skype as well, that's going to be not very satisfying for people watching. But I couldn't sustain it all the way. So essentially, what I'll be presenting is like half and half. Half of it is like written text, and the other half will just be me just talking. Hopefully that will be of use to you and to the day. I feel again a little bit disconnected because I could listen to the stuff that was happening earlier, and I'm just sitting in my living room on the floor because it's the best light in this position. Like, if I sit anywhere else, it just looks weird. So, all right, so I'm going to give it a go. So when I got the invitation to take part in this event, my initial reaction was to decline. As well as suffering from general fatigue as far as public talks are concerned, there was also something about the overarching topic, which was research of fascism as a cultural force, that made me reluctant to take part. I didn't want to spend any more of my time researching the rise of fascism, racism, and the far right in Europe and North America. For me, these ideas, ideologies, and systems of belief are the most rank and based examples of theory and socio-political practice, and I found the more time I spent reading and writing about them, the more dejected and emotionally hollow I felt. But Anna is really persuasive. And after talking things through with her, I changed my mind. So I think what had initially prompted her to invite me to participate in today's event was an article I'd written for a UK contemporary art magazine called Art Monthly. The article was called Cultic Cultures, and it was written in response to an emerging art world interest, it seemed, in crypto-fascism, racism, nationalism, and the many questionable philosophical, esoteric, and quasi-generic epistemologies that circle around those unifying theoretical linchpins. That's something I would never say naturally, sorry, that's just weird to bring back. Rather than a detailed journalistic exploration of the various organisations and individuals authoring, perpetuating, or taking part in that system of discrimination, I wanted to look into the phenomenon from a different perspective. I was interested in exploring the conditions that lead an individual to participate in and ultimately pledge a formal or informal allegiance to reactionary, fascist, and extremist groups. To do this, I turned to sociology and the work of one sociologist in particular, British writer Colin Campbell. I wanted to use his theory of what he called Cultic Milieu which is his word for a social space in which participants are brought together and groups are formed according to beliefs in specific scientific, theological, and philosophical ideas that are in contrast and opposition to the given mainstream. So, for those of you who might not be familiar with the term milieu, it's not really used that much in English. Milieu means kind of like your social environment, your social circle, I suppose, your interest group. Where am I going? And the idea of ideas that are oppositional to a main cultural mainstream, we don't have to be too pedantic about it and say, well, what is a mainstream? The idea of a mainstream just has to be real for whatever group member. The idea of a mainstream just has to be real for the person who is a member of some oppositional group. So although we may discuss amongst each other and say a mainstream doesn't exist anymore, somebody who, say, in a black metal group or a death metal band, pop music represents a kind of musical mainstream that is supported by, a mainstream media. Okay, so within this cultic milieu, that is a social circle unified by people who believe or have an affinity for kind of deviant ideas, the sort of ideas, topics that are circulating usually form underneath these main headings. So you might have environmentalists, the occult, people who believe in the supernatural, conspiracy theorists, New Agers, fascists, anti-fascists, animal rights activists, people who spot UFOs, people who believe in extrasensory perception. And the idea is that all of these ideas just sort of floating around, but once you enter the cultic milieu, you're more likely to come across them and get introduced to places that stop books on these subjects, or introduced to people who themselves are enthusiastic about these sorts of things. Okay, so today I'm going to talk for about maybe half an hour using parts of the original article I wrote for our monthly and some newer anecdotal examples. I'm going to suggest that one factor contributing to the resurgence of fascism as a cultural force is to do with an increasing number of people who are looking for definitive answers to questions of personal and national identity, self-worth, metaphysical certainty, and so on. Maybe the sort of classical way of thinking about this, traditional way of thinking about this is saying, the fragmented self that emerges after postmodernity causes a kind of existential anxiety in vigilant citizens and to decrease the kind of emotional, spiritual and psychological distress that this new reality presents for them, they then try to find some new universal truth to replace the old ones that we've thrown away with postmodernity. Okay, so I'm also going to suggest that although a distortion of that perspective, which is the person disenfranchised and alienated by this emergence of the fragmented postmodern self, multicultural society, blah, blah, blah. So although a distortion of that perspective is often used to craft the narrative of the disillusioned white working class male who becomes a neo-Nazi by the various exit organisations that seek to engage and deploy supposedly reformed neo-Nazis for the purposes of community outreach in Germany, Sweden and Norway, there is another set of individuals at risk of radicalisation. I'm just using radicalisation as a word for people who become enculturated into neo-Nazi groups. So this is a second category of people whose relative privilege, access to higher education and opportunity produces a different form of alienation and existential crisis. So rather than an individual turning to, say, Norse mythology and the iconography of the Third Reich because of a threat to a supposedly pure and consistent European identity, this second category of fascist sympathiser arrives at their destination through philosophical texts and esoteric bodies of knowledge that supposedly lift the veil of unreality, shrouding everyday life and darkening the vision of European and North American citizens who are slaves to liberal ideologies, globalization, and the state. So I'm just going to have a drink quickly, sorry. God, it's really hard work talking, like, because I can't hear myself on the microphone, so I'm just sort of shouting alone in the room. Anyway, and I've got really thin walls, so my neighbours are going to be like, what's going on? Okay, so of course, this process, the one I was just talking about, is not race, sex, religion, or gender specific, and I expect it works in much the same way for other sectarian groups. But because we're talking about fascism today, that's what I'll be focusing on. I should also say that I'll mostly be talking in abstractions today, which will mean a lot of what I'm saying will go unqualified with real-world examples, statistics from psychological experiments, or excerpts from interviews in the field, because I haven't done any of that stuff. Still, I hope this might be of interest and some use. And I'm sort of anticipating that maybe the talk that preceded mine and the talk that will follow will probably have loads more source material and hard facts. So I'll come away, I can sort of bask in their well-researched glory, maybe. Okay. So in his classic 1972 essay, The Cultic Milieu and Secularization, British sociologist Colin Campbell introduced the phenomenon of the cultic milieu, a cultural underground of society that is composed of and conducive to the creation of cults, which he defines as groups whose members are unified by adherence to a set of principles deviant from dominant cultural orthodoxies, usually relating to religious and scientific systems of belief. Although Campbell was writing about conditions in the early 1970s, I believe that a 21st century expansion of the cultic milieu has seen a growth of cultic or cult-like groups within society. Maybe you could say, another way of looking at it is saying, growth in subcultures. But yeah, I suppose that's another way you could characterize what he means by cults. But I suppose subcultures with a sort of more severe degree of ideological commitment for whatever group members are part of that subculture. So, I believe that a 21st century expansion of the cultic milieu has seen a growth of cultic or cult-like groups within society, and subsequently a growth in artists who are flirting with such ideas or imagery. So I guess we can talk about the alt-right here, neo-reactionists, self-identifying trolls, accelerationists, groups like the English Defence League, and clothing lines like the Tor Steiner clothing line in Germany, which is now blowing up elsewhere, I've heard. So this growth has been helped by three things. By the underground spilling into and becoming part of the mainstream, a process that has accelerated because of late capitalism has accelerated that process. So it's almost as if the undergrounds don't really exist. They pop up and then suddenly they're thrust into a kind of mainstream, and then they become outmoded and they just sort of spins around like that. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second thing, this growth has been helped by the World Wide Web's dispersal of deviant tendencies. So memes, web speak, groups like 4chan, the idea of like anonymous and pseudonymous communication online, which I think fosters a type of abusive interrelation. And then third, I'd say this growth has been helped by technologies of telepresence, of which I'm using now, that allow for heightened experiences of group membership. So, you know, before, if you might have been interested in neo-Nazi punk bands, it would take some work for you to connect with groups. It would take some work for you to find out who was the person closest to you in your area, who was someone who was a connection to somewhere else. You'd probably have to send off for mail order. You know, a tape might come through later. But now you can just jump in to that fray pretty instantly and sort of experience reinforcement and validation from other people who are sort of already there and waiting for you to sort of declare a type of kinship. This is all aided by the impulse in cult-prone individuals. People who are susceptible to the idea of cults. I'm using the term cult again in the Colin Campbell sense. So this is all aided by the impulse in cult-prone individuals who, in running from the potentially distressing realization that nothing lies behind the societal constructs constituting the world, seek out groups offering access to some essential truth. Now, what I mean by that is saying, okay, let's say we're all trying to function within a society where meaning is shifting. There is no overarching sort of grand meta-narrative or truth that we're all following. And so kind of uncertainty is the operative state. Now, that can be quite distressing for some people who feel that they need to have some singular and consistent notion of self, which is rooted in a kind of mythological history. And so maybe in that instance, if the traditional grand narratives are no longer available to support somebody, then they're going to, rather than just embracing uncertainty, embracing difference, embracing sort of multiculture, they're going to try and look for like one truth, a form of monoculture, and a sense of certainty. So Campbell uses and elaborates on this concept of seekership. So that act of like the initial psychological distress then has a drive-like impulse. So you try and reduce that by seeking out this alternative narrative. So Campbell uses and elaborates on this concept of seekership by having it define a kind of state of being for potential cult members, and also as the common ideology that unites the cultic milieu. So in other words, seekers are characterized as people who are seeking out alternative ideas, and that actual action of seeking out alternative ideas is the common ideology that brings them all together in the cultic milieu. So all these people who are operating in this kind of social circle of people seeking out alternative truths have a sense of kinship because they all share that thirst and desire for seeking out alternative ideas. Building on US sociologists John Laughlin and Rodney Stark's assertion that seekers are defined as those who are searching for some satisfactory systems of religious meaning to interpret or resolve their discontents, Campbell asserts that if this conception is widened beyond the restriction to a religious frame of reference, then it can be seen that this notion of seekership prevails throughout the cultic milieu. I think that if the areas of interest Campbell ascribes to the cultic milieu can be widened beyond questioning religious and scientific orthodoxies to include the aesthetic, the philosophical, the political, and the psychoanalytic, then the operative mode of those engaged in the practice, interpretation, or display of contemporary art can also be defined as seekership. This is because the foundational activity in contemporary art, at least since the early 1970s, is rooted in the critical interrogation, or at least the investigation, of dominant cultural, social, political, economic, and aesthetic orthodoxies, a process that involves the necessary embrace and/or the authorship of deviant epistemologies. Okay, so I'm going to come off paper now and loosen up a bit, hopefully. So what that sort of somewhat verbose exegesis was supposed to set up was this idea of okay, there's a cultic milieu and some people are and there's maybe two types of person who may be susceptible to well, I don't know, sort of detrimental ideologies within that cultic milieu. On the one hand, we have this traditional, almost stereotypical idea of the disenfranchised, possibly white working class male, who then seeks out some kind of I don't know, Norse mythology in order to support themselves. But I'm also saying that there's going to be somebody else who's involved in looking around in these facilities, and that person is the contemporary artist. And I'm making a case for the contemporary artist being somebody who's in these spaces looking, sifting through different epistemologies and bodies of knowledge. I'm making a case that that is the basic mode of functioning for contemporary artists. Like that's as long as I guess since structuralism, post-structuralism, we understand that the majority of reality exists as a kind of linguistic construct to be deconstructed by us in some way, shape, or form. Then we're kind of always seeking new ways of interrogating what is presented to us as reality. And I think what I was trying to say is that the danger here can happen when somebody gets seduced and loses their necessary disposition of skepticism, and then embraces some new ideology or new narrative as a kind of new universalism. Can I say that? So I guess what I felt like I could see happening amongst people in the UK art world at the time was that rather than using skepticism to question everything that they were coming across, there came a certain point where they were accepting some of the things that were being said as the truth. You know, I suppose underpinning that notion is the idea that there is somewhere some body of knowledge that represents the absolute truth. And obviously we all know that's not the case. But I think, again, that's obviously for people who feel that is the case. Maybe that's another incarnation of the anxiety that arises due to what they perceive as a kind of postmodern relativism. What the problem is as well is that, okay, within the field of contemporary art at that time, people were having access to these sort of questionable bodies of knowledge, were then using aesthetic tropes from them, but using the register of irony to protect themselves from, well, critique and from fully committing to what it was that they were sort of flirting with. I think Lana's going to probably talk a bit more about that later when she talks about the LD50 gallery. So I'm just gonna leave that out there as not really fully fleshed out in an example. But I still feel that there's something quite sinister about that dalliance with the iconography, the symbolism, and the epistemologies of discrimination, basically. So that was essentially what I was trying to write about in that text, but in a more abstract, overarching way. And now I'm just going to talk about a few anecdotal examples of how this sort of stuff has happened, or how I've encountered things that also convinced me that this was something that was going on. And then maybe the combination of what I've just read, what I'm about to say, and then people talking to me afterwards, asking questions, some kind of clarity is going to emerge if it hasn't already. Okay, so could we just have the first image up quickly? Can you guys just sort of say yes if you can you all see that? Yes. Yeah. All right. Okay, this is an image of a neo-Nazi punk band called Screwdriver. Is everyone familiar with the band Screwdriver? No. Okay. So that was like 70% yes. Sorry, 70% no, 30% yes. So Screwdriver are a neo-Nazi punk band, I think, that emerged in the late 70s. Started out as like a normal punk band, then came back as full-on neo-Nazi sympathizers. They were aligned with this kind of... they were aligned with this counter-movement to what was called Rock Against Racism. And Rock Against Racism emerged in the 1970s as a reaction to like racist comments that were said by Eric Clapton at a concert. And they were created to combat the rise of the far right, or more particularly the National Front in the UK. But what actually happened within the neo-Nazi contingent is that they tried to have a kind of answer for Rock Against Racism, and their answer was Rock Against Communism. And Rock Against Communism, or the RAC, was this network of neo-Nazi bands who presented themselves as, I don't know, saviors of democracy, which is a kind of weird echo of people using like the Palestinian scarves in neo-Nazi movements today. Anyway, digressing a bit. The reason why I wanted to show this image is because the first time I encountered somebody who was a reformed neo-Nazi was in Serbia, in a small village called Kosjerić in the early 2000s. Now, I knew quite a lot about neo-Nazi punk bands just because I was interested in music and I was interested in punk, and so I just I was doing the same thing that I'm explaining in this piece, which is I was always seeking around for stuff that was different to the mainstream, and because I was doing that, I sort of stumbled across neo-Nazi punk and also that subgenre of neo-Nazi punk films, stuff like Romper Stomper or anyway. So yeah, this is the first time I was in Serbia on a trip helping people out, and this guy was in this small village called Kosjerić, was desperate to get me to come to his house, and I was like, why does this guy want me to come to his house so badly? And I was on what was called a work camp, and we were given a task to, each of us had to prepare a national dish. As I was from Britain, I was going to prepare shepherd's pie. Don't know if anyone knows, I think supposedly a British dish, shepherd's pie. And this guy was desperate for me to make it at his house. So I was like, fine. But when we got to his house, after talking for a bit, and I told him I was a guitar player and this and that, he took me upstairs to his room and pulled a box out, opened it, and it was full of neo-Nazi memorabilia. Like, so much stuff. I mean, neo-Nazi stuff. So you had like Third Reich sort of army stuff, but also he had like posters and compilations. And he gave me a tape compilation of bands, one of which was Screwdriver, other bands like Combat 18 and Public Enemy. And I was always surprised by this guy's affiliation with neo-Nazis, because there was nothing in his neighborhood. There were no minorities there. And it was my first sort of real world encounter with the allure of like belonging. Obviously, there's nothing going on for this person. And then the neo-Nazi group offers kinship. It offers a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, a sense of history that's sort of valiant, actually, heroic, mythological. And so, of course, this guy was going to be attracted and enticed into this deviant group. But luckily, after a while, he chose to leave it. But I guess that was my first experience of, I guess, the phenomenon I'm discussing. And in that sense, you'd say that's more a classical example of disenfranchised white working class youth living in suburbia being attracted by a far right group. Okay, so now I want to talk about a different example. So could we slide the second image? Can you all see that image? Yes. Okay. So that image should be a kind of collage of 3 different images. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. So in the bottom left-hand corner of this image is it's a contemporary artist, Bonnie Camplin. Now, I think a couple of years ago, Bonnie Camplin was up for the Turner Prize for a work of art she called the Military-Industrial Complex. This work of art was basically about young men who believed that they had been brainwashed through the MK Ultra monarch mind control process used by the CIA to create special agents who could be triggered due to trauma-based mind control. The installation that she used at the time was full of books about secret societies, esoteric bodies of knowledge, Gnosticism, spirituality, voodoo. Basically, she had presented a kind of Cultic Milieu library. And then me and Bonnie were in a correspondence after this exhibition. I interviewed her and we talked about doing some work together, I think. And during one of the conversations, she told me that she was really into and interested in the image on the bottom right-hand side, which is a video course by a guy called Jan Irving, who I think is big on the Gnostic scene. And he is discussing this system of knowledge called the trivium, the quadrivium, and so I don't have the image, so I can't quite remember exactly what it was. But this was this idea that education is like a system of imposed ignorance, and that if we want to fully understand about our environment, we need to go back to classical Greek tenets of learning, which are learning and logic, which are the trivium and the quadrivium. I think it's basically a fancy way of talking about maths, science, philosophy, humanities, but that these should be the tenets of education from early age. Rhetoric, that was another one of them. So I listened to this. I listened to this show, and I'm always taken aback by how these people accumulate so much knowledge about such strange ideas, but also that at the heart of it is essentially a conservative notion that we have to go back to classical antiquity to get a sense of the right way of doing things. But then halfway through this discussion, they started to talk about the image on top and refer to this woman who is an anti-feminist. And they were explaining that she had an enlightened view, and that this is somebody that should be listened to and somebody that should be followed. And so I was interested here in how this was another way in. This was another way in to essentially what I think is a way to a type of fascism. You often notice, for me, I have anyway, that the road, like I say, you can say the stereotypical road or the classical road, which is disenfranchised, alienated youth, no jobs, no prospects, has to seek something that's bigger than themselves, and that gives themselves a sense of unified identity that they can measure against this sort of fragmented, multicultural, postmodern contemporaneity. So that's one side. But there's this other side where people who are just intellectually curious or doing what it is that contemporary artists do can get introduced to to these ideas. And for me, this was one way that it happened, in the same way that maybe Gnosticism leads to the manosphere, leads to Milo Yiannopoulos, leads to the alt-right, leads to actual fascism, leads to membership of some sort of political party. Okay, so just the last slide. Can you all see that? Okay, this is an image of someone called Devonte Hines. At this time, he was known as Lightspeed champion, but is now known as Blood Orange. He's wearing a T-shirt by a band called Burzum. Is everybody familiar with the band Burzum? Yes. Burzum, a black metal band. Well, it's a one-man group led by someone called Varg Vikernes, who is a convicted murderer, white racist, white supremacist, homophobe, goes without saying. A thoroughly unpleasant individual who believes in the superiority of the Nordic races and that ultimately everybody else should probably be exterminated. What is going on in this image then? How can somebody who this person hates wear the same T-shirt? Obviously, what's happening is a layer of irony. I feel like I don't really want to pick on Dev because I'm sure that he was wearing that with an awareness of this sort of thing. And I'm sure he wouldn't be caught dead in that T-shirt anymore, especially as his music tends to be about black emancipation, Black Lives Matter, and yeah. But what I'm trying to get at is this sort of ironic posturing is something that goes on quite a lot. And whereas a person of colour can only go so far in performing that is, as in you're barred from membership of that group, somebody who's not a person of colour can go a lot further. And although I couldn't find another T-shirt of somebody who represented this contradiction, because Dev Hines Dev Hines is somebody who's quite well known. He's obviously a person of colour, so the contradiction is readable. If I just found an image of like a random hipster online with a Burzum T-shirt, it wouldn't have them the same resonance because, hey, they may be, who knows, they may be sympathising with Varg Vikernes' ideas. But I've met quite a few people in London who wear this T-shirt who aren't people of colour, but do it in a way through the veil of irony. And I think this is another way that people move towards affinities with far-right ideologies and rhetoric, basically. Yeah, so I don't really want to say much more than that. It's been a bit of an odd experience. But basically, I hope I've given you a bit of an illustration of what I'm talking about, backed up with some anecdotal evidence, and maybe we can get closer to some clarity now if you interrogate what I say or somebody else interrogates what I say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Morgan. It was incredibly clear. Well, I hope it was to everyone in the room. I'm sure it was to everyone in the room. Which way? That way. Where is he? Yeah. Ah, okay. God, this is so confusing. So we're going to open up into discussion in a little while, but just for the moment, I'd like to see if there are any questions for Morgan. One thing here, which is, of course, it's always important to use the microphone, but it's particularly so this time because Morgan can't hear anything if it's not through the microphone.
Yeah, can't hear.
So, can I take any questions? Where? Oh.
Right. Okay, thanks. Amazing. Very, very illuminating. I just want to ask with regards to the use of irony, especially in the last part of your talk. First of all, irony was a key feature of postmodernism in the arts, at least, right? So my question is whether this postmodernism that you argued has passed remains, and effectively, this kind of decontextualized appropriation, as it were, is precisely an aspect of it that still survives as an ideology, however. And the other is whether, in the example of kind of like black people kind of actually identifying, perhaps over-identifying, I don't know, with white supremacy or all this kind of like cultural expressions of it, can there not be also an expression of internalized oppression to the point of self-hatred? Like, I mean, can we just stay at the level of like irony, or can there be something much more sinister culturally in operation? Thank you.
Yeah, okay, so, I think what's interesting about Dev Hyde is that he was part of a band called Test Icicles. I don't know if anyone remembers that band, Test Icicles, but basically Test Icicles it's the word testicles, but they split it in half. And the band was like, they were supposed to be like a shit band. They didn't want to perform. They actively were like, our music's rubbish, you shouldn't buy it. And so their whole persona was one of irony, and it was like you'd go to concerts and they perform a tune and be like, yeah, this is a pop song that some of you bought, and play it. But I think their irony is a lot different to a kind of measured, cerebral detachment that some people may have performed in the art world in like the later 80s and the 90s, let's say the high point of postmodernism. And it's more a kind of youthful nihilism that just doesn't give a shit about anything and doesn't care, and finds that a kind of liberatory existential position. So I think him wearing that Burzum t-shirt is almost a hangover from his transitional period from being in like I mean, they were also kids. They were like 17 or 18 when they were in this group. So why I feel a bit bad about showing that image is because he's someone who's actually sort of done a lot of growing up in public, from being a child and just doing stupid shit to like being somebody who's conscious and has a politics now. So I don't think also you have to say that there may be something else slightly more sophisticated happening at that time. Like somebody who's a person of color wearing that t-shirt, that kind of arch non-committal attitude also diminishes somewhat the power of something like Burzum. But I think you could argue that somebody wearing that, laughing about it, does something to the demonic power that this person that Varg Vikernes has tried to cultivate through this image of like austere, Aryan, Nordic severity. So and also it's interesting on the website where you see that image, there's all these comments below it where people are like battling it out, like what does it mean for someone who's a person of color to wear this t-shirt? And in a way it's like, if you wanted to get a bit more academic about it, you could say that Test Icicles and Dev at this time were embodying the persona of the trickster, the person who like does stuff to reveal societal mores and leave everybody to fight out amongst themselves. I wouldn't have said that. I definitely didn't read it as like self-hatred or self-loathing or anger turned inwards. So yeah, I think it was just more like, how do you shock as a young person? How do you show society that you couldn't care less? And one of the ways is to flirt with this stuff that is transgressive. But that's part of the problem, you see, because that can only go so far for somebody who is a person of colour. I mean, maybe there's some people out there who've gone a bit further. I don't know, but I think the hazard is that for other people, that I saw on the scene doing similar things who were not people of color, who were white, the gateway is open for you to embrace white supremacy or to go further and to get deeper into that scene. I mean, obviously, you can wear that T-shirt, but go into one of the Ableism concert in Norway as a person of color, probably not the most, healthy thing to do. So, yeah, I think I'll stop there. I don't know. Have I answered? Hopefully, I've answered part of your question.
She's nodding.
Okay. Cheers.
Do you have any more questions? Yes, there's one just there. We get the mic up to 6 or 7 rows back.
Hi. Sorry, I don't know whether my question just comes out of being naive, but I remember you said something about the fact that it's okay to be a seeker, but it's bad only if you lose your skepticism in dealing with the world around you.
Yeah.
But I was thinking, because personally I had an experience of having to discuss with somebody that really believes in chemtrails very much.
Yeah.
And when I found evidence, actually, for example, that the European Parliament had a parliamentary interrogation about it, and they concluded that there was nothing. He simply dismissed it as, oh yeah, but it's because they're lying. So there's still skepticism somehow, but it's redirected. How do you relate your discourse with that?
Could you just say that? Could you just say, like, I got what you're saying, but I'm going to try and answer that, but there's a risk that I might not answer it properly because I wasn't sure I understood, but I don't want to make you repeat it. So I'll give it a shot, and if it doesn't work out, check me on it. So I think when I'm talking about skepticism, there's a difference, I think. There's like, so evidence-based skepticism, if somebody's talking about chemtrails and you're just talking to somebody, okay, then obviously you're not going to take what they're saying at face value. You're going to do some research, right? So to me, that's a skeptical position because you're just not taking it as read. But and it's falsifiable because ultimately there's going to be some evidence out there somewhere that supports or supports or undermines what it is this person's saying about the existence of chemtrails. But if someone's there just sort of saying, there was a long time ago that this guy called Odin made this mythological race called Aryans, and we are the saviors of the world, and all we have to do is get rid of every person of color and like queers and like reduce women to like subservient positions, then this wonderful magical world order is going to come back to normal. That's a different level of skepticism, isn't it? It's like, that's unfalsifiable. How are you going to go back in time to discover whether or not Odin was around? And I know these are extremes, but I suppose like within the Cultic Milieu, there will be different epistemologies that have different evidence bases. So I don't know. I think in the face of anybody purporting to have an ultimate truth, you've got to be like, show me it. Where is it? Like, how is it provable? Where's your evidence? And more often than not, when people embrace far right ideologies, the evidence is simply that they feel it in their soul. It is true because they are that subject. Oh, does that make sense? Like if somebody says men are superior, then I'm not gonna. If somebody's not, then more often than not, someone will just say, "Yeah, I feel that way." So it is true. Yes, I feel that way. Everybody else around me is reinforcing how I'm feeling. I don't know if so. Does that address what you're saying about skepticism?
Yes. Yeah, we have more nodding. Yes.
Okay. All right.
Is there another question? If not, I might have one.
Yeah.
So, Morgan, you wrote a widely debated text recently for Efflux Conversations on the new conservatism, I think was the phrase you used.
Yeah.
It seems to me that particularly when thinking about the relationship between art and fascism, like this art's entanglements with this new conservatism seem to be one potential kind of route for connecting the two. So this is, I guess, kind of slightly detached from your discussions of the cultic, but I thought it was an interesting thing that potentially could be brought into the conversation. So I thought I would first of all invite you to maybe just kind of really briefly summarize what it was that you were interested in, what your argument was, but also maybe think about how that might relate to the question of fascism. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so just briefly, the article. Okay, just to qualify, the article was published on eFlux, but it wasn't written for eFlux. It was written for hard copy publication. They wouldn't publish it, so I just put it up on eFlux without asking anyone. So that, yeah, slight distinction. But I wrote the article. My conception of the new conservatism was to say that within the UK art world, there are a number of people who are maybe setting the agenda, and they are ascribing to, who are doing this thing, which is professing like progressivism. So they're saying, we're for change, we're for diversity, we're against cuts, you know, we want things to move forward. They're doing that on one hand, and then on the other hand, their actual actions are doing the complete opposite. So that's why I was saying it was a new conservatism, because old conservatism is just open about its wanting to keep things as they are and to stop progression. Whereas the new conservatism, people pretend like they're the most socially engaged person you've ever met. I mean, I'm being, you know, a bit exaggerating here, but they, you know, pretend to be progressive, but actually they're working with the same corporations. They're happy to do stuff to help state, and they're also doing things in service of securing sector homogeneity. So I wrote this article trying to identify certain people who I feel are perpetuating this by looking at accounts, by looking where money goes, by looking at where money comes from, by looking at how people act, by looking at their behavior, and then also suggesting that what we shouldn't do is what people have been doing for years and years and years, which is engaging with them and trying to get them to reform. I feel like so much activity has been spent just hoping that if you can teach people about the faults of homophobia, racism, sexism, I don't know, ableism, then all of a sudden we'll wake up and there'll be a brand new day. And my thing is that these people already know it, and they're not going to change because they have a vested interest in keeping things the way they are. So the article was about identifying these people, these institutions, and saying what we need to do is do something new. Stop trying to engage them. Let's withdraw and build. And it wasn't mutually exclusive. I wasn't saying it's either or. I was saying, yeah, obviously, it was actually quite a measured and quite a, you know, I pulled my punches basically, you know. So how I would relate that to fascism, I don't know. I'm afraid I'm struggling immediately to make the connection, but maybe you could help out.
Well, Lance just put a hand up. Maybe Lance going to help out.
Maybe Lance can help out.
Do you want?
Hi, Morgan.
Hello.
Well, I suppose the way that I would make that connection is just simply in what you said about they've got a vested interest in things staying the same, and so when you get the appearance of artists working in the kind of ways that you described in your Cultic Cultures article, where there's a flirtation with the far right, or these modes of seekership, or entering into these cultic milieus. Really? Do I need to be closer to the microphone?
I can hear you.
Okay, Anna just shoved it in my face. Okay. Anyway, there's not going to be any kind of pushback from the institutions which you criticised in the new conservatism, because ultimately there's then a flow through from the sort of structural forms of white supremacy and sexism that exist in the art world and are maintained, and then the exacerbation of that, I would say. I mean, that's the connection. I don't know whether you would agree with that, but that would be my fear about the connection.
I can see how. Yeah, because I suppose it's like a traditional form of transgression. It would be recognised as a traditional form, like in the same way that you know, when we look at bands like, what's that band that Genesis P-Orridge used to be in? Throbbing Gristle.
Psychic TV or Throbbing Gristle.
Throbbing Gristle, yeah. Or just like, there's this tradition of bands flirting with the far right or fascism as like a stylistic trope. So, yeah, it's like an acceptable transgression.
I think so, but I also think it's about the way in which the rise of the far right in Europe and the US has come out of neoliberalism, or has found it's like a seedbed within the conditions that preceded our current moment. And so I would also just say that if the art world within its new conservatism is complicit with that, then there's no reason why this should present a major threat to it or be something that it would necessarily oppose.
But then, you know, yeah, not to get into this too much, but then I'd say, I suppose the reason why I say it's acceptable transgression is because if something is overtly fascist or Nazi, then it doesn't play. Yeah. Because people who are involved in the art world, they may have a vested interest in things remaining the same, but they also have a vested interest in furthering the kind of the most capitalist conducive forms of liberalism. So gender parity, as long as it's along the sort of lean-in lines. So I guess I'm just thinking, when you go beyond that to like proper fascism, I think it would have a problem.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.